In 1976, Richard Chase was hospitalized for blood poisoning after injecting rabbit's blood into his veins. He explained that the injections prevented his blood from turning into powder. He was institutionalized after this. While in the mental ward, Chase would capture birds through the bars in his bedroom window. He'd rip off their heads and drink blood from their necks. Hospital staff called him Dracula, as they often found him with blood smeared around his mouth. And yet, after being prescribed antipsychotic medication, Chase was no longer viewed as a threat to society and was released into the care of his parents. He stopped taking his medication and soon began accusing his mother of trying to poison him. His parents responded to this by purchasing him an apartment and moving him out of the house. While living alone, Chase regularly captured, killed, and disemboweled various animals he'd find, including one of his neighbor's pets. He would make himself smoothies out of the organs and the intestines. Chase believed that drinking these smoothies would prevent his heart from shrinking. During this period, he also developed an obsession with firearms and purchased several handguns. One day in 1977, Chase rang his mother's doorbell and dangled a dead cat in her face. He then knelt down, tore the cat's stomach open, shoved his hands inside of its belly, and smeared the cat's blood all over his face. His mother allegedly responded to this by returning inside the house and closing the door, leaving him there. She did not report the incident to anyone. While some young children torture insects and sometimes animals due to curiosity or unresolved frustrations at home, usually as they age they develop a conscience, which informs them that they are hurting the animal, and they stop. With a conscience, a child develops compassion and sensitivity towards an animal, and typically a strong distaste for hurting an animal. Severely dysfunctional family systems can play a large role in the development of a conscience. We know that within his childhood, Chase grew up with an incredibly dysfunctional family and that his father used to physically beat him. Some surmise that he responded to this abuse by directing his fury onto animals. Unfortunately, inflicting injuries on animals is common behavior for people who go on to commit violent acts against humans. In high school, Chase became an alcoholic and began taking LSD in extremely high doses, during a time when LSD was particularly strong, whereas in the 1960s and 70s, the typical dose was around 300 micrograms or more. Today, it's between 20 and 80 micrograms. And if you have some underlying vulnerability to developing a mental disorder like schizophrenia, something like LSD can trigger a psychotic break and lead to the disorder. I want to clarify here that most people who have the diagnosis of schizophrenia do not go on to harm other people and are typically at most risk of harming themselves. As his drug use increased and his mental state spiraled downward, Chase also realized that he differed from his peers in that while he was attracted to females, he was unable to achieve an erection. He began to believe that his own blood was incompetent, and that his blood flow was responsible for the lack of an erection. He therefore concluded that if he had gotten blood from an external source as a sort of supplement, that might do the trick. By the time he was in his 20s, his behaviors and beliefs became increasingly bizarre. Chase thought he was dying of various ailments. He was convinced that his skull had split apart, and that the pieces were shifting and growing outside of the back of his head. He believed that his stomach was upside down and that his pulmonary artery had been stolen. His most persistent fear, which was ultimately connected to most of his killings, was the belief that his blood and organs were slowly turning into powder. Chase was diagnosed with a condition known as Cotard's delusion, also known as walking corpse syndrome, which is the belief that one is missing body parts, or that one is dying, is already dead, or simply doesn't exist. Those with Cotard's delusion might even believe that nothing exists. In his film Synecdoche, New York, writer and director Charlie Kaufman explored Cotard's delusion through the eyes of his main character, Caden Cotard. Kaufman had been asked to make a horror film, and this was his version of what a true horror film should be about, examining mental illness and the reality of what living with something as terrifying as Cotard's delusion might actually feel like.